This is Inner Healing Paths podcast. Here we discuss the healing of the mind, body, soul, and spirit through a variety of different paths. We have emotional and spiritually minded conversations centering on ancestral healing, psychology, astrology, yoga, meditation, magic, and indigenous spiritual practices of the world. I am your host, Rosa Shetty, and I am so happy you are here. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you are new here, my name is Rosa Shetty. I'm a licensed mental health therapist from California. I'm a podcaster. I am a writer and just a lifelong seeker of knowledge and wisdom. And I love sharing it with you all. And I know that there are thousands of podcasts and audiobooks that you can be listening to in this moment. But the fact that you are choosing to spend this time with me, it just means so much. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. I do hope that you find this podcast helpful, that you enjoy it. And I just want to ask you all for a big favor. If you have not subscribed to the podcast, please do so. It really helps just to get the message out there. And if you feel called to, if you feel that this was helpful, I would also really appreciate if you can leave me a review on Apple Podcast. Again, these are the little things that you can do to help me get my message out, to help me be able to continue sharing and bringing in guests and sharing all this wisdom with you all. So thank you again from the bottom of my heart for being part of this community with me. And now I want to go into this episode, the episode that I have prepared for you. This is with Dr. Pavna Sodhi. And when we actually got together to plan this episode, we had no idea what was going to be going on. For the last month, we've had our community, our BIPOC community here in LA and everywhere in the US. But, I'm in LA, so I'm seeing it from up close, targeted. And the trauma, the terror that has been planted in our communities is real. And please know that if you or your loved one have been impacted by this, I see you. I'm holding space for you, for your safety, for your dignity, for your humanity. And this episode was with you all in mind as we were recording. And this conversation is going to be about racial trauma and how it lives in the body, especially as it relates to ancestral trauma, immigration-related trauma, and what healing can look like, especially when it's grounded in culture and when we involve and include spirituality as a tool for our healing. Dr. Pavna she's a therapist as well, like I mentioned. And so she just brings in this depth of a clinical lens to it. And from her own cultural background, there's many elements that she shares and of how this impacts her in a deeply personal way. So I'm just so honored to have this conversation with you all and for you to be able to listen to what Dr. Sodhi has to share. And whether you're a therapist or a healer or just someone trying to heal from your own wounds and carrying, so much of this past within your body, I really hope that you find this episode healing and helpful for you. And before we go into the actual episode, I do want to give a brief disclaimer. The information shared on this podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. And although I am a licensed mental health professional, I am not acting as your therapist, and this podcast does not establish a therapeutic relationship between you, the listener, or any of the guests that are presented here in the podcast. The content shared here is not meant to diagnose, treat, or provide medical or psychological advice. Any tools, stories, or perspectives offered here are just shared in the spirit of support and exploration, but they are not a substitute for professional care. If you are experiencing emotional distress or if you have a mental health emergency, please seek support from a licensed mental health provider and or contact the emergency service in your area. By listening, you agree not to use this content as a replacement for professional mental health or medical care. And with that, let's get into the interview, and I hope you enjoy it. Take a listen. Okay, welcome, Pavna, to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Rosa. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today.
Yes, I know we connected a couple months ago, and I'm so glad that we're here now and we're able to sit down and do this recording. And you and I were just chatting a little bit before we started recording, and we talked about just how timely this interview and this conversation with you is for us here in well, for me specifically here in LA, but all over the US. And I'm sure can you share with the folks where you're from? I know you're
Yeah. So I live in Ontario, Canada, but I'm originally from Nova Scotia, Canada. So I'm in the central part of Canada, but I was born and raised on the east coast of Canada.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I'm sure you guys are getting all the news and the info as to
We're
what's
getting
going
the
on.
news. We're definitely getting the news, but we have our own set of concerns happening here with potential bills being put in place around immigrants and permanent residents and such. So it just seems to be a real continental issue, not exclusive to the States anymore. And I'm wondering if the two countries are influencing each other. I mean, we don't know. I mean, it seems to be that way historically, but yeah.
It's like a virus, right? A contagion.
Yeah, I would say so. I would say so.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Why can't the good things get contagious, right? But well, thank you and welcome. And let's dive in. Are you ready?
I am absolutely ready. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So tell us a little bit to start off, just a little bit about yourself and the healing work that you do.
So by training, Rosa, I am a registered psychotherapist. I am a adjunct professor. I do some speaking as well, and I present workshops. And I am an author. So this has really kind of become my professional identity, I would say, over the last 25 years. And I've really appreciated every element of it. At one point in my life, my career, aspiration was to become a professor. I really wanted to be in the classroom full time, but that wasn't in the stars. So I learned to pivot and say, okay, well, what else can I do to help others? And so that's where psychotherapy came into place, writing came into place, and reaching out to the community in different ways. So that is what I do, I would say through a Western lens. But if we were to look at it through an Eastern lens, I feel like my meaning and purpose right now is to just decolonize everything. So whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the therapeutic space, whether it's in the community and educating others around leaning into Eastern practices, or even in the host culture. So whether I go to conferences or conventions, it's like, how can we recognize that some of these modalities that we've been using in these spaces are not they just don't land for our immigrant, multicultural, or BIPOC communities. So this is kind of where I'm at right now in my profession.
Okay, thank you. And so a lot of folks, I'm sure, have heard the term to decolonize or colonial,
Sure.
So I'm wondering if just to get started, and for the folks that need a more specific definition of that, how would you describe what a decolonial approach would be, whether it's in the
Sure.
classroom or in therapy?
Yeah, so basically, when we look at something that is decolonized, or we're implementing a decolonial approach, we're extricating ourselves from a Western individualist, um, Eurocentric way of thinking. And we're trying to implement more collectivist, Eastern, inclusive approaches. So this is what we're doing. And it can be something as simple as establishing safety and trust and what that looks like. It's also about, you know, I think about it in mental health, for example, that we need to be mindful of the potential systemic oppression and intergenerational trauma our clients experience, because sometimes that's overlooked. And we need to tap into their lived experiences. We also need to, look at their ancestry, and we need to use approaches that are really going to resonate with them. So that might even mean not using these Western leaning therapeutic orientations that we are sometimes taught about in our Western trained education. So how do we kind of combine something that works for them? So in my book, I have created quite a few frameworks, as you know, my book, Trauma Informed Psychotherapy for BIPOC Communities. And in the title, it has decolonizing mental health because there's so much emphasis on it. So we're looking at things through an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive lens. And that is really all encompassing, looking at things through making it more, inclusive, making things, accessible for our clients. How do we get them to even become interested in therapy even. So I'm talking more about therapy, I guess, than being in the classroom. So all of these things matter, but they also need to feel safe, right? And that safety piece is sometimes lacking in our Western approaches that we use in the clinical settings.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I feel that so many of us, I'm saying us because I know that when I started practicing, I didn't realize this word. I mean, I'm talking about almost, this was back in 2007. This word wasn't necessarily a term that we didn't even have social media back then, right? So it
No.
wasn't something that was talked about, and even in grad school, it wasn't addressed. However, my background is in social work, so I went to grad school for social work, and one of the things that I appreciate so much about my education as a social worker is that perspective of the person in environment perspective, understanding human behavior within the context of a person's macro, macro and environment, and then we used to call it meso. I don't know if they still call that in
Yeah, they use those terms. Yeah.
in micro. And so that's kind of how the lens that I was trained in. And as I'm bilingual and Spanish speaker. So when I started in the field, I started working with the Spanish population, monolingual population in my community, doing the field work. And looking back, I feel that I started with that. I didn't know the term, but I feel that's a lot of folks, whether they're doing social work or therapy, a lot of times we're already doing that work. We're already understanding humans and the complexities and the nuance of their life and lived experiences, but we may not have the terminology to call it what that is, right? So that's why I appreciate reading your book and getting like a definition to know that the way we work, the way we practice, there's a name for that, right? There's a term, there's an academic research field behind it, which is what your book brought to just my awareness, which I appreciate so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Rosa. That means a lot. And absolutely, I think a lot of us have been using these approaches without even being able to name it or even having the language to describe it. I know back in the day, before I used the word decolonial and decolonizing and such, because the two do differ a little bit, I used to say that I'm a culturally sensitive therapist, right? And then moved on to culturally competent, and now I'm culturally responsive, right? So we have to also be mindful of even how the language is evolving and is changing, right? But even in the classroom, everything had to be culturally infused. I felt like I didn't get that education. I was trained by, older white men. And don't get me wrong, I learned a lot from them, but I was really missing it. I'm like, well, what happens to marginalized folks who want to come into therapy? And how are they supposed to, feel safe in the work that we're doing together, this collaborative work that we're doing together? So I made it an intention in the classroom, especially to make sure things were culturally infused. And I kept using that term. It's culturally infused. We're going to be making sure things have are seen through a multicultural lens, because back then, as you are probably aware, Daryl Sue's work was very well known. There was a few theorists that would talk about these topics, but it wasn't mainstream. It wasn't mainstream. So in that, I decided to create my own approaches, whether it was in the classroom, created some frameworks, and then of course this book that has, as you know, quite a few ideas of how to decolonize different spaces that we exist in.
Yeah, I think now that what you said just reminded me of being in my undergrad,
Mm-hmm.
is studying social work in undergrad, and we learned about the intergenerational transmission of trauma and that model.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't something that was being studied necessarily in a clinical setting by a psychotherapist or in the psychological setting. It was more from a anthropological, social perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And now I see that it has shifted. And I know your book talks a lot about that aspect too, which I'm sure we'll get into, and applying it to the clinical work that we do. And that part, I would say, is becoming a little bit more mainstream, but that's new. I mean, I'm talking because I'm reflecting on my education over 20 years ago, and that wasn't something that we talked about from a clinical perspective. It was always discussed from the perspective of the understanding the macro system and that lens where this family, this person is coming from, to understand their behavior now. So it's interesting now to see, and in your book talks about that, about how to apply that to the clinical setting, right? That's, I think, relatively newer-ish, right? It's in the last maybe 5-10 years. I don't know. You probably know more in that regard.
I mean, it's fairly recent. I think we've
Yeah.
all have kind of explored trauma, but now kind of looking at trauma, representing different types of trauma, whether it's big T traumas or little T traumas, right? Because I think when we used to think about the word trauma, it had to be something enormous like a war or a natural disaster. But now we're including things that are happening in individuals' childhoods, or something like a divorce or a separation, or even having like a physical health condition that and so I think it's great that we're broadening it, because really when we look at the word trauma, it means a wound, right? And it can be a physical wound, can be an emotional wound, but it can really manifest in different ways. It can manifest in different ways. And then when we look at it through intergenerational trauma, imagine all the nuances associated with that and all the different roles that are present even within.
Yeah, it's so complex, and I think that's why there's such an hunger for to know what this is, right? It seems like, oh, what is this? It's such a fancy word, right? Intergenerational trauma. What is it? And it sounds very almost. Okay, it's recording again. Sorry, we had some technical issues. I was in the middle of a sentence.
You were, yeah.
What was I saying? Like, what was I saying? Yeah, I think I was talking about intergenerational trauma, and it's such a big word. And I think that's why folks are so intrigued by it, right? And it's like, what is it? But that's relatively a new thing that we're seeing, especially as it applies to the micro. Now that we're talking the micro, the individual level in the therapy room, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, and so let's so before we continue, I'm curious if you're okay sharing with the folks a little bit about your cultural background and the diversity within you. And
yeah, oh my goodness. So I guess I can share my intersectionality, which is like my social identities. So I go by the pronouns she, her. I am a second generation South Asian Punjabi Sikh cis het woman. I think I've been saying this recently, I feel like as I'm getting older, I am definitely gravitating more towards my ancestral culture than I am towards the Canadian culture where I was born. I was born and raised. And my background, I mean, essentially is this, that my parents immigrated in the 1960s. They had a very non-traditional courtship. I think back in India during that time, it was all about arranged marriages, but my parents didn't have an arranged marriages. So right from the start, it was not very traditional. My dad is still, both my parents are alive still, thankfully. Very, very progressive. But both of them believe strongly in preserving culture,
Mm.
religion, and language in our home to the best of their ability.
Mm.
So we traveled a lot back and forth to India to do that. And we also did a lot of that at home. So we were very fortunate. The language was kind of lagging a bit, but we caught up by going to India and learning how to speak the language with our grandparents and our relatives. So we
Mm.
went back frequently, like I would say almost every year or every second year, depending on what the political climate was in India, because there was a lot of unfortunately, there was a lot of terrorism and there was a lot of violence. And so we had to be careful. We had to be careful, but it was their intention to certainly take us back as often as possible.
Mm.
So
Yeah, I
yeah.
that's yeah, no, that's so interesting. So you speak Punjabi? Is that the
I
name of
speak
the?
I speak Punjabi. I would say that my Punjabi was definitely better years ago, and I'm kind of going back to it. I'm practicing it more. I'm taking like language classes. I have
Mhm.
apps on my phone because I really want to improve it. I can certainly think in Punjabi. I can provide therapy in Punjabi, but I really want it to be a little bit more free flowing, and I
Mm.
miss that.
Yes.
So that's what I'm working towards right now. And I also understand Hindi and Urdu, and I can speak a bit of Hindi as well. So it was very important for me
Yeah.
to make sure I maintain the language. With that, I mean, if we were looking at it through an intergenerational kind of dimension, I have two daughters, so it was also very important for me to transmit that to my children. So they're third generation, and that can mean a lot of things depending on how much culture and religion and language I preserved as a Punjabi Sikh woman. But so far, so good. I mean, I'm very proud at how much they appreciate the culture. I'm all about appreciation at this point, and awareness, and also being proud of their ancestry. So I think that's part of the battle when we even talk about things like intergenerational trauma and what happens to our identity, as well as internalized racism, right? So I think I mentioned in my book, I'm pretty sure I mentioned in my book. Sometimes I get confused. Where did I mention it? But I mentioned in my book that sometimes when we are in a place where we are feeling no sense of belonging or we need to fit in, we, internalize that racism. And then sometimes we forget about our cultural identity. But thankfully, that hasn't happened so much with my children, right? Because we've been very, very consistent
Yeah,
about
and
keeping that cultural pride.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that speaks to you, the work that you've done as a mom to instill that intentionally, right? To make that a point in your parenting.
Yeah, it's a big part of it. I mean, they're a big part of my life, both of my daughters, and I'm just really impressed with how much they have appreciated over the years and their connection to culture and religion and language, as well as with their relatives and
Yeah.
and extended family. Yeah.
I love that. I can relate to that. I have little ones. They're, 5 and, baby. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm in that too, trying to instill in them that pride that you mentioned in their
Yeah.
heritage, their background, and through different ways, but the awareness, the pride, the interest, right, in
Absolutely.
learning about their culture and where they come from. My husband is from, well, his heritage is Indian. He's from
Hmm.
here. And so my daughter has the two heritages. So I tell him, like, you need to, you need to do that part and I'll do the other part. So together we're trying to instill in her that awareness and pride for her two backgrounds
Hmm.
that are huge, part of who she is, and or hopefully, who she will be growing up in her identity.
So I always tell her that you are, you are American and you're Indian and you're,
Hmm.
Mexican. And I always emphasize that
Amazing.
you have three cultures, right? And you're
Hmm.
so lucky. So, but it's an intentional work that we need to do as parents. I think it doesn't come natural,
Yeah,
in the environment that they live in, we just let them be.
of
It
course.
won't naturally come to them. Right.
Yeah. We have to definitely be consistent, and we need to also make sure and encourage, I think, our children to be curious too
Mhm.
about their culture. So it can be anything. I mean, I think what happened during my upbringing, and I mean, they could only protect us so much because there was so much going on in India at the time with the riots and the genocide and everything else that was happening, unfortunately. But we can't shield them from all the negative things that are happening. So I have really made it a point to talk about all the good things about the culture, and maybe not all the good things about the culture. Like, it's really has to be a combination of both, so they can make an informed decision of what they want to preserve and what they want to transmit to future generations, right? Because there is things that I talk about in my book, as you know, around shadeism and colorism, and a lot of interminority tension that happens, and how do we deal with that? And I know my eldest daughter particularly has really, really experienced um, a lot of negative commentary because of her complexion. And I don't, we need to educate a bit on that and why that happens, right? So we've
Mhm.
had some really great conversations about this whole need to be, fairer skin because it represents status and proximity to whiteness, which is not really the greatest thing anymore. We don't want that proximity to whiteness anymore. But back then it was like that because of the
Yeah.
British rule and the partition. And then we look at the whole generational piece. Like, it's just very multifaceted, Rosa.
Yeah. Yeah. It was rooted in their survival, life,
Yeah,
literally life or death, right? And easier life or a harder life, so it's very
sure.
much rooted in that survival instinct that our ancestors had to navigate. And yeah,
Hmm.
and I know that, I mean, it's so you're referring to India when you talk
India, yeah.
about,
So
yeah.
India, the partition of India and
Hmm.
Pakistan, and then eventually it was Bangladesh too. So
Mm,
that in 1947 has really
mm,
called. I mean, even prior to that, with the colonization of India by the British, has really shifted things a bit. I think actually, and my cousins in India would kind of joke about how they're 50 years behind. And I think really, when I go back there, it feels like they're 50 years behind,
mm,
just in a lot of ways. But then they're so advanced in other ways, right? Because, you know,
mhm. Yeah.
they're creative and they're hardworking and whatever else. So they can kind of push through some of that.
Mhm. Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And there's, I mean, you mentioned that, and here we have, just a tremendous history here, and I'm talking here in America,
Sure.
right,
Yeah.
with the colonization of the indigenous peoples of the
Mm-hmm.
Americas, and then, of course, from my background in Mexico, not to mention, the Spaniards went and colonized
Yeah.
Mexico, and it was so there's so much that is so deeply rooted, and as you were talking about, we have different our ancestors are all living through us, right? And
Mm-hmm.
when we think of our lineage, we're talking about all of those influences, right? And showing up in different ways and different behaviors and different emotional reactions, and
Mm-hmm.
even the trauma that we may not even be able to put words into it, but we're having an experience of,
That's
you
it.
know,
Somatic response.
yeah, and that's
Mm-hmm.
the root. So it is so big and it is
It is.
so
It is.
complex, and it feels so big to even to grasp. So, um, in your book, how would you describe it for just folks listening, whether you're a therapist or you're in therapy as a client, how would you say that it is an approach, just a way to be able to identify some of these racial trauma, colonial trauma in our everyday experience, and how can folks start becoming
Yeah.
aware of how it's manifesting through them?
Yeah. I mean, what a great question, And I think a lot of the times do we start with something Western, like psychoeducation? Or do we kind of tap into our bodies and see where it's landing, right? And how it's impacting our nervous system. I think once we have that somatic response, as I mentioned earlier, or a visceral response, then it's like, okay, well, what doesn't feel right here, right? And what has happened here? And what has made us feel uncomfortable? And what can we name as a result of that? And how can we process it? How can we unlearn it? And how can we heal from it? And I know that sounds very, very, very general, but it is definitely a framework that can help individuals to really start from within and then be able to kind of look beyond and heal from whatever it is that they've experienced. So I think about things like microaggressions that are becoming more and more common in the therapeutic space. Comments that we would have maybe not thought were insulting 20, 30 years ago, but are certainly insulting now, whether it's around somebody's appearance or their cuisine, like their cultural cuisine, or the language that they speak, or their name even, you know? I remember when I first started providing therapy, and my name, it's not a difficult name, but for some it's harder to pronounce because the first A in my name should probably be a U, but that's how it's spelled. And I remember people just used to say, well, what kind of name is Pavna? And I think as a young practitioner, I didn't take that as a microaggression. I kind of was like, okay, well, it doesn't feel right, but it doesn't feel racist. So what is it exactly? But now what I've done, I think, and I've mentioned this in my book as well, is that when somebody asks me where I'm from, where am I really from? Because that's, the big question. Even though I say I'm like born and raised in Canada, it's like, no, no, where are you really from? So they're kind of asking, well, where's your ancestry? And when I say, well, I used to say, well, my parents are from India. And that was, of course, 10, 15 years ago too. But now I identify as I'm a second generation um, South Asian immigrant, right? I've taken it back a bit. And then I try to make it a teachable moment by educating them. I mean, I even had a client yesterday who was wondering about my cultural background. And I really make it a teachable moment and try to reframe it a bit because in the past I probably would have been upset about it, right? But it took me time to
Yeah.
do that, you know?
Thank you for sharing that because I think that's very helpful. Because as first generation, for me, being a Latina
Mm-hmm.
and even I know even for my husband, he's also first generation Indian American. I know that that's a question we get often asked.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's at work and with our clients, and sometimes it's just like when we meet people, other
Yeah.
parents, at our daughter's school, or it comes up, and I never thought to answer it like that. I always, what you said, oh, my parents are from, that's how
Mm-hmm.
I typically answer, but you just gave me a really, a really good pointer to really take that as a moment to teach them that I'm from here. I'm American, and,
Yeah.
and I'm second generation, so it's almost like
Yeah.
my culture, or not even culture, but like my heritage, right? My ancestors
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is da da da. But really, so I think that's something that a lot of folks, I think everyone that is first generation, that speaks another language, that looks non-white, BIPOC, we get asked.
Exactly. Yeah.
We get asked that
Yep.
a lot.
And if you
Yes.
if you have a bit of a mixed look, then that even too becomes confusing.
Yeah.
It's
Anything
like,
that doesn't look, yeah, like you if you can't bypass as white,
yeah,
then it's like, or white passing, then it's like, okay, what are you?
yeah,
Yeah, where are you
yeah,
really from, right? Like you said.
exactly. Well, and even that, I mean, for some people, they don't even believe that when you say, that you're second generation South Asian, they're going like, no, there must be something else in you,
Mm.
right? Because you don't look like a typical South Asian person.
Mm.
Right? So
Uh,
it's like then
yeah.
you have to like unpack it even more or break it down even further and say, well,
Yeah.
everyone
Mhm.
has a different look and there's different influences and I don't, but I also, what I want to say here is that we can keep our response short, but it shouldn't be an explanation because then it goes it moves into the territory of trauma responding, right? And over explaining and people pleasing and all of this. So it's really all about how do we keep it a teachable moment, right?
Mm, mm.
Without it activating our nervous system.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and you know, I noticed there's also like this. You mentioned how we are things that would people would get away with saying, like those microaggressions back then are now people, we hope, are being a little bit more careful, but we're also seeing the opposite, where a lot of people are just saying the most racist,
Oh yeah.
nastiest things that you would be shocked. No one would ever say that 20 years ago, right? You wouldn't hear
Yep.
that. We would hear more of the microaggressions, the thing, little subtle things. Now it's it's so polarized, right? Folks being very, very people being very sensitive to certain to names and terms and all these things, which is great. And then we have the opposite, people just being so just horrible with with what they're sharing publicly, right? So it's like we have these two super polarized streams now when it comes to how we talk about BIPOC and different cultures other than what's the main here, the American, or for you the white, what's the Canadian, right? The white Canadian.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think what's also happened too with social media, people feel they can say whatever they want in the comments. They can post things, racist videos or reels or whatever else, and it's getting bad. Like it's getting bad. It feels like every time something happens, at least when I, watch or go onto my social media sites where my algorithm is mostly Canadian, it's like there's just generalizations and stereotypes and prejudice against a lot of racialized groups, right? So we saw a lot of that, um, during COVID with the Asian communities and that speculation that they brought COVID over to now we have an influx of South Asian immigrants in Canada. So there's a lot of South Asian hate right now in Canada, a lot. And it's horrible, even with last week with the Air India, um, flight that crashed in Ahmedabad. Same thing. There was like horrible jokes around it, and it's almost like wanting to extinguish a race completely. For what reason? But these were also the communities, like the South Asian community and the Asian community, that were, held in high regard because of the model minority myth. And so they were also invited to occupy positions that the Canadian, we'll call them Canadian folks, could not occupy. So it's a interesting dichotomy around this extreme racism. And then, of course, this model minority myth, which is also very racist too, but it's almost like the other end of it, right? Like it's very complex.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering if you would share a little bit about, because trauma informed is a phrase that we hear a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Hear it, and a lot of people talk about it as a way to describe what they offer, their services, whether anything from coaching to workout to yoga. We hear this trauma informed phrase. But can you give us an example of how trauma informed would look like for communities of color? What does it look like in practice?
Yeah, so when I think about it, I mean, there's obviously several definitions around trauma-informed care, but I look at it through, again, more of a decolonial lens. So it would be able to, like the individual, with the guidance of the practitioner, would be able to name the traumas and to become informed about the traumas, educated around the traumas. It's around understanding what self-regulations like versus co-regulation. And in that, should there be some community care practices? Meaning, should we lean into some of those community care practices? And what does healing look like? Right? So those would be some of the approaches I would use with my clients. And then the other thing that I have recognized with my work in trauma-informed care is understanding how, and I've said it a couple times now, how our nervous system responds to these situations. So whether it's through educating our clients on polyvagal theory and trying to understand where they're landing or mapping maybe their nervous system, and having a general idea around that too. But the naming of the traumas is the first part.
Mm.
And understanding, naming and acknowledging that it was a trauma, because I think there's a lot of denial
Mm.
and
Yeah.
spiritual bypassing around some of these traumas. Well, it was meant to happen. This person was supposed to pass away as a child, versus recognizing this was traumatic, and how are you going to deal with these emotions and feelings? And what are you not going to pass down to a future generation, right?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. It starts with awareness.
Yes.
That's what I always tell my clients. It's like we have to first be aware that this was traumatic, right? Otherwise, how can you possibly heal something that you're not even aware of, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible. So it starts with that acknowledgement. And I think for the folks listening, even just asking the question, even just having the thought of what this is, why did this happen? Was this traumatic? I think that is even a good place to start, because you're already having some awareness of these questions. And I think starting with the questions is, you don't need to understand it all, but I think just having questions about this and questioning what happened in the events and the people that played a part in it, that's a way to start this journey.
Or even how it's somatically manifesting within you too, right? Because there's a bit of that. It's like what happened to you versus what's happening in you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think there's also, and I do mention it in my book, around being ready to talk about these things, right? So, whether it's being resistant and not being aware, to then being reluctant through maybe therapy or further conversation with family, or even, gathering more information, to then being ready to talk about it, right? So part of what it is in this, in the approaches that I use around trauma-informed care, is to meet our clients where they're at. That's the only way. And we don't want it to be like the treatment plan to be on our schedule, as in the practitioner schedule. It has to be on the client schedule, right? Which is something I think is very common in Western training. It's like we have these goals, we have these short-term and long-term goals, and we have to achieve them. Versus what I use with my clients is more intentions and aspirations, which are not as definitive and are flexible, right?
Yeah.
And I think that language just really, really it lands well with my clients, because they're like, okay, so if I can't meet this intention, we can revisit it and see what else we can do, maybe modify it or whatever that is going to help them work towards it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Is for me, just in my approach is always like start where the client is, where they are at, and making an effort to meet them there.
Exactly.
And then from there we go. But it's always starting with where they're at. And that's a hard thing to do, because a lot of times we see people and we can see what they're struggling with, but they're not even at a place where they can name that or be in awareness of that. So we can talk about it all we want, then it's not gonna land until they're ready for it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So part of what could happen there, and this is something that you've likely read in my book, is that we can start by understanding their intersectionality and ease them into the process, right? Understanding their social identities and their awareness even around their social identities, right? To then looking at encounters with systemic oppression and how these identities kind of have an interplay with the systemic oppression, to then exploring the overlap between the systemic oppression and unprocessed trauma, right? And that's where they might be able to name those traumas, and whether it's trauma from the past or the trauma they're currently experiencing.
Yeah.
to then looking at suffering and healing. So there's a bit of a process involved.
Yeah, no,
But how do we ease
absolutely.
our clients into it, right?
Yeah. How do you see the naming of the trauma? So I know, and I'm asking
Mm,
because in your book you have a list
yeah.
of several types of traumas, and
Mm,
in your own practice, how important has it been for you and your clients to actually name it something, to say this is,
ye-
this is colonial trauma, this is migratory,
yeah.
how important has that been for you in your practice?
It's been extremely important. I think it's necessary because that just really sets the tone for the rest of the treatment plan and how we're going to explore it and what kind of approaches we're going to use, whether it's polyvagal work, whether it's another narrative approach. It just really depends. And sometimes there's confusion around colonial and cultural trauma. So then we have to unpack it further. So it's like a starting point, right? So it's a starting point. And a lot of these different types of traumas, they overlap each other too. But then we have to make sure, okay, well, this experience probably represents something that's racial. If it's like, with racial trauma, it has to happen repeatedly,
Mhm.
right? But intergenerational trauma, it could be like an event that their great grandparents experienced. So I think having that language is important for our clients and maybe even having that shared language. So I work with a lot of South Asian individuals. So we do talk a lot about the partition of India. I work with a lot of Punjabi individuals. So we talk about even the different types of traumas that have happened within the last 150 years within the Punjabi Sikh community in Canada. So it's helpful. It definitely is helpful, not only in having meaningful and purposeful therapeutic dialogue, but also in securing that therapeutic alliance with our clients or with my clients. I've found it very beneficial. And I do use that list. I do
Yeah,
use the list.
yeah, and I'll go through the list right now because I have it in front of
Sure.
me.
Yeah.
So you have so in your list, it's in your book. So for the folks listening, and I know you go in and you describe each one.
Mm,
So we have colonial trauma, cultural trauma, developmental trauma, intersectional trauma, post-traumatic stress, PTSD, and
mhm.
complex PTSD, migratory trauma, systemic trauma, collective trauma. So these are
Yeah.
the different types of traumas, and I could see how it can get someone, this is not definitely not something that I'm an expert in, so I could see how it could get confusing for folks. So I think
Hmm.
having that understanding and being able to define it for them, like this is what you're going through, or this is how
Yeah.
this symptom is manifesting, but it really is related to X, Y,
Hmm.
and Z trauma. I think that that in and of itself is such an eye opener for folks. I think, I mean, because this is not something you talk about or hear about. Even these terms, even with social media, I don't come across some of these at all. I was
Yeah.
looking at the yeah, intersectional trauma. I know you were talking a little bit about that, but that's
Yeah.
not something you hear about.
No. No. So I wanted to make sure it was all encompassing because it's not really just, when we look at some of these traumas, it could be culture or race related, but we also have to look at other variables that are contributing to somebody's trauma. So whether it is their gender identity, whether it's their sexual orientation, whether it's their class, all of these things kind of play into it as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And
Yeah.
Pavna, I want to ask you something a little bit more personal. I'm wondering, how has your own healing journey evolved as you've grown your work, as you wrote this book and expanded your practice? How has your own healing in regards to this and other things that you've gone through, how has it grown and expanded since you've been on this journey academically and professionally?
Yeah, well, Rosa, it's a very, very long answer to your question, but I'll give you an abbreviated version. So I've had some ups and downs in my life over the last 25 years. Lots of good things, but and you probably read it in my book too. I had a very, very difficult, toxic marriage, which led to me internalizing a lot of the stresses that I wasn't able to name at the time. And that then became some chronic health conditions that really encouraged me to revisit and change some of my ways of being. And so I made it a point. I've written 2 books, and the first book was under a lot of stress and a lot of just hardship. And then my second book, I wanted to rewrite the narrative. And I made sure that it was written in an environment where it was positive, it was supported, that I was able to be as creative as possible. Because, when you're not able to name trauma and you're in a very traumatic situation like my marriage, and the creativity wasn't there. I was almost just trying to get it done. It was almost like an assignment for school, for grad school even. So in terms of my healing, I've just been really intentional about meditation and yoga and exercise and self-care, daily self-care. I spend a lot of time with my children, and I have joint custody. So when I don't have them, I'm thinking about them and getting ready for them. So there's a bit of that gives me that joy. They're the little glimmers of our day. Nutrition, connecting with people. I've always been very, very extroverted, so I love to socialize. I like anything live, theater, music, but that's what really kind of grounds me, you know? And this work has been phenomenal. Like, the book has been out for a year now, and I'm so happy with the reach. It just really is a reminder that we all need to be part of this conversation all the time. And so how can we continue to expand on this productive allyship and put our words into action? So that's really been super important as well in my healing journey.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's like you said, it's the air we breathe. I mean, it's
Yeah,
everywhere, right? Yeah. There's no
it
way to
really is.
separate us or even our clients from
Hmm.
the systemic difficulties and traumas yeah, that are continuously happening, right? It's not something
That's
that just
it.
happened in the past, but we continue seeing it everywhere. And like you said, we talked about at the beginning, it's almost like a virus. It's,
Hmm.
we're seeing it more and more in other parts of the world also.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I think there's also something we said, I just kind of want to add a bit around the healing, is that even if intergenerational trauma has been passed down, we have to heal between the cycles.
Mm.
So it's not just healing within our current generation. It's like what else has been passed down that we have to heal from. So we're
Hmm.
constantly engaging and healing, right?
Yeah.
And making sure that those conditions, or those thought processes, or those, whatever it is that has been passed down, ends. So how can we even become cycle breakers of sorts too, right? So
Yeah. 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 And you do talk about that in the book.
yeah.
Would you say that would you recommend your book also for folks that are not that are not therapists? Because I know you wrote this
Yeah. Yeah.
for
So
psychotherapists, but
hmm.
yeah, what is your recommendation for the, just folks that are not in this field?
So it is geared towards mental health care professionals. I mean, really. But I have noticed in the last year that there are doctors, there's lawyers, there's nurses, there's people in the RCMP, in the police force, that are interested in this
Yeah.
material. So really, it's for anybody who works with BIPOC, multicultural, or immigrant communities.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
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 And Pavna, for those that would love to get to know more about you and the work that you do and maybe
Mhm.
connect with you, can you share your social media handles and your website?
Yeah, so I'll start with my website. It's Pavna K Sodhi, so PavnaKSodhi.com is my website. And then my Instagram handle is at Sonotherapy, Sunotherapy. And then I have a LinkedIn handle as well, which is Pavna K Sodhi. And I think And I also have an X account too, but it's not as active.
Yeah.
But those will
Okay.
be the three main ones.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I'll include it in the show notes also.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming today, for sharing all this wisdom and your knowledge with us. I really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I think that sometimes I have folks on that it's hard for me to have a conversational
Mhm.
approach because I feel like I have to be more Q&A because there's not, I just I don't know, it's hard to bounce off with what they're saying, but with you, it just felt so natural. And I know that this is, the second time we talk, but it already feels very, you're very warm and very engaging. And it's just so it makes it easy for me to have this conversation with you. And I hope that the folks can get that from listening to our podcast. And yeah, so grateful for you for joining today.
Thank you so much. And I felt the same way. It doesn't even feel like an hour has passed.
Yeah, I
We can
know.
talk forever.
I know. I always say
Yeah.
that when I'm having a good conversation, I'm like, oh my God, we can talk about this forever, but we really can't.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. So thank you again. And I hope to have you back, maybe the next book,
Yeah.
your next project,
Next project.
next project.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll
Yeah.
see. We'll see when that is. But again, I really appreciate sharing space with you today.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you found it healing and nourishing to your mind and soul. If there's a friend that you think would benefit from listening to this information, please share it. Share about our podcast. If you feel called to, please leave us a review, as this really, really helps boost our presence here in Apple Podcast, and it makes it easier for others to find us. To stay up to date on new episode releases and special events and projects that I'm working on, you can follow us on Instagram at Inner Healing Paths Podcast. And you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to my website, which is rosachettilcsw.com. And I will include this information and links in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to sharing with you again next time.